What follows is an excerpt from today's astrology class in which I talked about Nancy Pelosi's chart and the fact that she just experienced a bad fall while traveling in Europe, and this is correlated to the very full moon that I described yesterday, the full moon acting as a trigger in the event, as well as, perhaps most importantly, the transiting Pluto, currently in early Aquarius. She's an example in which this planet is having great effect because of her natal Saturn, natal Pluto, that are in a square in early Taurus to Leo, which means the transiting Pluto triggers them. And you will see that in this particular case, at least in the initial stages, the effect is, is negative, is traumatic. It leads to surgery, emergency surgery, which the chart also describes. Indeed, a very fascinating part of it is that you can see the locality chart. So in other words, there's a natal chart, and there is what happens when you shift the chart's position to Luxembourg and the effect that this has on the entire pattern. There was a full moon in the 1 a.m. range Pacific, but 4 a.m. in the east, in the 23, almost 24 degrees Gemini Sagittarius. And these full moons tend to heighten the energy and can be definite sources of triggers. So if you have a planet in this region of Gemini Sagittarius or of Virgo Pisces, then this full moon can become a trigger to something. And so by way of illustration, you may have heard about Nancy Pelosi and her hip injury. She was in Luxembourg, and she fell down the stairs and had to be airlifted to Germany to get an immediate operation on her hip because she broke her hip. And so now, before I show the patterns in her chart, I will say this right away, which is that it relates to the Pluto-Saturn square that she has at birth. It's very tight. You can see Saturn at 0:45 minutes of Taurus and Pluto at 0:40 minutes of Leo. A very tight square in the chart. But before I explain this chart, I will tell you that Saturn-Pluto can be quite harsh. It's an energy of something difficult that is happening that requires reconstruction, some kind of destruction, reconstruction of something. And even if you say the final result can be great, because once you get to the other side of it, the situation can be renewed, and that's great. But in the middle and at the time of the event, it definitely isn't a lot of fun. So looking at her chart, we see some really interesting things happening at the time of this accident. First of all, you have the Pluto-Saturn square, which is basically a harsh energy of change, of some reconstruction, something that needs to be fixed, taken apart, etc. And Pluto in her chart rises, and that makes it immediately a body planet. By rises, I mean she's Leo rising. Pluto is in Leo, so it's a first sign planet rising, body energy, first sign, first house. And you see that as this event happened, the transiting Pluto, because Pluto starts here at birth, transiting Pluto is in the early degrees of Aquarius. And this is where I've said a number of times on the channel, and probably in these classes as well, I've said often when Pluto is Pluto entering Aquarius, has a lot more impact for people that have planets in early Aquarius, early Taurus, early Leo, and early Scorpio, because then it makes a dynamic angle to those points, and so then you get important things happening. And so there it is. The Pluto is in early Aquarius. Now, to be fair, it was already here before in 2023 a little bit, very briefly in the spring, and then earlier this year. It's been there already, but it didn't trigger this formation then. It triggered it now. As to why, you could say that's a little mysterious. This just goes more to the fact that when you're in a zone with a planet, because Pluto is going to be in these degrees, Pluto being a slow mover for 2 to 3 years, roaming around the degrees. But just so happened that now it got triggered. But you do get more information from the full moon, because notice that concurrent with this Pluto hit, you also see that the full moon happens at 23 plus, almost 24 degrees Gemini to Sagittarius, which therefore makes a square to her Neptune in her chart. And the significance of this is that, first of all, Neptune is in a health sign, so that's one pattern. Secondly, Neptune is co-ruler of the 8th, which is the place where you would get surgery, which is exactly what happened to her. She went and had emergency surgery, emergency repair surgery. Notice that the moon is in Sagittarius, which is the sign of the hip. And as it would also turn out, in this case, very interesting that her progressed chart, that's a totally different way of measuring, but when you're doing progressions, you look at the days after birth, see where things are. You know, Nancy is now 84 years old, so this progressed moon has gone around the chart by progression, not quite 3 times, but approaching 3 turns, because the progressed moon takes 27 days, to go around. No, actually, so it has done 3 cycles. It hasn't done 3 new moons, but more than 3 cycles already. So, point being, though, that right now, the amazing astrological coincidence, which is what you've probably heard me say a number of times, that astrology is in a sense, the study of meaningful coincidence. So isn't it amazing to see it right at the same degrees of Sagittarius as this is happening? And so therefore, you've got the Pluto is the key, but then you've got the full moon acting as a major trigger to an important planet to add to that pattern, right? Now, separately, before I show you the locality, which gets downright spooky, notice the stations and how important they are, because you can see that in 2010 her progressed Venus was in its station at 70 days. Now, the way these stations work, it has that flavor of horseshoes and grenades. In astrology, once you're in the vicinity of something, there is activation, meaningfulness, it's extra important. So in other words, rather than saying it only happens at 70, you would say something like 68 to 72 or even earlier. The point being that 2010, Nancy Pelosi, it's actually at 66. That was when she became leader of the House. In 2006, 2010 was, she actually lost the House then, as it turns out. But in this region, her prominence went way up. Now, 66 corresponds a little more with the Neptune station in her chart. The main point being that 2 important stations are happening in this vicinity, signaling that major events, major things are happening in her life. And, essentially from 66 to 2022. Was her career in the Senate as a leader. Not always the majority leader, only some of the time, but nevertheless, these become really important stations in her progressions, right? But now, if you turn to this being the natal chart where this happened, this event, you turn to where it happened, which is in Luxembourg. And what's really interesting is when you take a natal chart, if you move east, she's born in Baltimore, so you get across the Atlantic, you move east, this ascendant will progress in this direction. So middle of the Atlantic, Virgo, Libra, then by the time you get to Luxembourg in Europe, and by the way, this includes Germany. It's close enough to Germany that in Germany it's only a couple of degrees more down from where it is here. But in Luxembourg, where the event happens, notice that Scorpio rises, and notice that the Saturn and the Pluto, they go to the angles of the chart. Saturn right on the close to the descendant angle, the Pluto down at the bottom, squaring, and then the full moon, instead of cutting across these houses here, in 511 in this chart, in Luxembourg, it cuts across to 8, which are the surgery, the 8th is the surgery house. So would the progressed moon be there as well. So you get that effect in the Luxembourg chart. So this is where the locality will often show you something extra, something important about what just happened to a person. And the other thing that I noticed that is very interesting as well is the Antiscia. You may recall from a prior class, Antiscia is related to the idea that if you look at a natural zodiac, and if you think of a planet being at 1 degree Capricorn, the Antiscia is on the other side of that in Sagittarius. And if it's 2 degrees Capricorn, it's 2 degrees in this direction. So 2 degrees Capricorn would be 28 Sagittarius, 3 Capricorn, 27. there's like a mirror image effect taking place from 0 Capricorn, 0 Cancer, but also 0 Aries, 0 Libra. They are the cardinal points. And the cardinal points are where things start. It's where the solstices and the equinoxes happen. And it turns out that knowing the Antiscia of your planets is quite important. It can be really important. I believe I showed you my own chart last week, and a point in my life when I was the sickest I've ever been. And the Antiscias degrees were being triggered in major ways. And notice that in Pelosi's chart, the Antiscia of her sun, which I put in here already, it's right there, it's at 23 degrees. So her Antiscia is right where her Neptune is. Now, this is significant in that the full moon is not just triggering the Neptune, it's triggering her Antiscia sun. So now you have her sun, which is her vital energy, as well as the ruler of the ascendant. You're adding a really important secondary factor that adds fuel to the fire, so to speak, and correlates with this in a really intense way.